So in this next discussion in this class on research and action research, I want to spend a bit of time talking about ways of analysing the data that you're gathering. And I was so interested in your different projects, mathematics, English, music, art, and a number of different areas. And it's very exciting to gather the information and very exciting to see some of the data come in, fresh new insights. But then we have the challenge of how we analyze the data by coding it, by analyzing and examining it, and looking for themes and ideas in that. So one of the ways in which you can begin by analyzing the data is thinking about what's the task involved. And so if you go to Google Scholar and type in analysing the data, action research, and then in education, schooling, you'll get some information both from Google, but also from Google Scholar on analysing the data. So if we put in action research, analysing the data, and we then put in education, so analysing of data in education. So we do a Google search on that. Then you'll find some valuable resources there. And so you could read through those. And then we've said that it's even better if you go to Google Scholar and go to the college library. So if we take that same question about analysing the data and what's some of the information we can gather, and type into Google Scholar, action research analysis of data in education, and I could add schooling and teaching to that as well. Then we turn up some valuable resources here. We could also look at in Australia, we could add the terms in Australia. And then if we click on Cite, we've got the full details of the resource, and if it's got the resource listed down the side, then we can click on that and we can open it up and look at it. So very quickly we can gather some information on ways in which we can analyze the data, and you could include some of that in your research project. When I also looked at that, I brought up Clark, Pereth, Thiel, and Job, Action Research by New Prairie Press, Chapter 6, and I found that particularly useful in that this book has an excellent discussion of action research and begins with Chapter 1. What is action research, particularly for classroom teachers? There's some great material there, well worth reading. And you can also look up the authors and their background and find out some more about them. So I encourage you to make use of this valuable resource by Clark, Pereth, Thiel, Job, on action research by New Prairie Press, and you'll find some great material there. In their introduction, they point out that the primary purpose of action research is to carry out an action in which you seek to improve education in maths or English or another subject, and then in carrying out your research, you seek to measure the improvement or the changes that take place to see how effective it is. So they begin with 4 questions. Firstly, what is action research? That is, what is the actions that we do as teacher, and how can we research the effectiveness of these actions? Secondly, what is it appropriate for an educator to do? That is, what's ethical? And one of the challenges we've noted is that if you introduce an action like giving more information and help, and you don't do it to another group, then are you disadvantaging the second group? And one of the ways we solve that is by also at a later stage carrying out the same help and same resources and advice to that second group. So both groups are treated equally. And we try and protect students as much as we can and help students as much as we can. Thirdly, how does an educator conduct the action research project? And we've gone through in the first part of this course in discussing what are the actions, what are the questions, what are the ways in which we do the literature review, and now methodology. And then out of the methodology, we gather data. And today we're discussing analysis of the data. And then fourthly, what does an educator do with the data and the analysis? That is, how do you write it up and communicate it to others? So in looking at the data gathering, as an action researcher, one of the things that we're wanting to do is to collect a coherent, reliable account and story from all the data collected. So as you begin to analyze your data, you really want one major point that you're seeking to make, one major thesis, argument, story that you're seeking to tell. And you should be able to write this down in one sentence or two sentences at the most. You should be able to say, from the data I've collected, I have found that. And you should be able to write that out. And that conclusion that you make will come partly from the data, original research that you've done, and also partly from the literature review where you've interacted with the data that others have collected. As this book points out, before you begin your data analysis, you should revisit your intended goals. That is, what is your subject seeking to do? What's the curriculum seeking to do? What are you setting out to do in this project? And you should think about your research questions, and these may change as you find that there are more valuable or slightly different questions. You should reflect on your literature review. That is, what are other scholars finding? And then you should envisage how and what you are investigating and why this investigation is important. So then you carry out your methodology, you gather the data. The next step is to organise your data, to sort it out, to code it, to check through it, and to see how reliable it is and what does it tell you. You might want to look at notes you take as you observe, as you reflect, as you talk to other teachers. And you could keep a diary and gather the notes on different days and diarise how you get them. And then you may discover that you need additional data. So you might conduct a second or third interview or gathering of questions or focus group where you gather a group of people together to discuss some of the things they're working with. More importantly, you may have noted unanticipated, new, original ideas that you'd not expected. That's where the real breakthroughs come from, when you identify things that were quite unexpected. They're the aha moments that can be so valuable. So certainly I encourage you to look out for those. If you go to chapter 6 of the book that I'm recommending, you'll find there some very valuable resources. And so in chapter 6 of this book, if we put it in, you'll find there valuable resources and also some examples that you can look at as well. So if we go to these examples, they give you an idea of the outline and what it might look at and what it might look like as you write up the project: introduction, literature review, research questions, research design methodology, interventions and actions that you're setting out to take, setting and context, the sample that you're collecting, and then how you go about collecting the data. And so we see here in this book in chapter 6 that we have a number of examples of projects that you can work with. And disappeared on me now. But if you go there down past analysis and presentation of the data, you'll find an example of a action research project on mathematics and how they look at the analysis of what it means to introduce terms and words in mathematics in order to give a better conceptual understanding of the vocabulary of maths. And so there's a great little project there. Notice there's an abstract at the beginning, an introduction to what they're doing, the literature review, which is so important, could be longer in this case, I think, research question, what they're setting out to do, the intervention or the action that they're seeking to do to bring about the beneficial change, and then the design and methodology could be longer, the setting and the context and sample that they're taking, and then some lovely little graphs of who they're gathering data from, then the gathering of the data itself, and they display that data gathering in various graphs, and then as they analyze and examine the material, certain themes are identified and then a conclusion is made. And in their conclusion, they talk in this example about some of the insights that they find. There are several themes that stand out from the research into maths vocabulary. Direct instruction of mathematics vocabulary and operation keywords through teaching daily worded problems in mathematics helps the students and brings about a greater understanding of what is taking place. So that's one example. And there's other examples as well that you could go to. A couple more on mathematics, some on English expression and literature. And so if you're wanting to look for examples of an action research project to model yours on, then you'll find those here. And so I'll put that in the chat. And if you want to make a copy of this, then you can put that in and you can go to the contents and you can read the whole of the book if you wish, and you can find that quite useful and helpful in what you are doing. Notice as well that your action research is often located within a place where you can explore attitudes, behaviors, feelings. You might want to take some notes on attitudes, behaviors, feelings, social context, psychological insights. And much of the data will be gathered in various ways, notes, and you might want to gather as much data as you can. You then got to analyze and interpret that data. And so that's the next challenge that you will face as you go further, analyzing and interpreting that. As you do so, you might want to develop a framework, an outline that's going to show what you are doing. Often you don't have time to transcribe all your data, but you may be able to have notes or take recordings or gather interview data or focus groups that you can go back to. And there's no one universal correct way to analyze the data, but there are a number of steps that you can take in order to examine the data. Firstly, you begin to organize it in different ways. You begin to gather it. You begin to put it under headings. You begin to look for support from one form of data for another. And this is often called triangulation, whereas you look at two or three or more different viewpoints that point to the data. Secondly, you look at the content itself. You go through your observations, your notes, the material that you've gathered, and you think, wow, this is what really stands out. Thirdly, you highlight the most significant data. What is most significant? What's most interesting? Fourthly, you develop categories or codes for the evidence that you are gathering. And coding is a particular useful arrangement where you develop key words that summarize the data, and then you review and narrow your codes. You want less and less, and you want to focus on specific ones. And then you look for various interpretations, and you go back to your literature review, or you may do further literature review. You look for ways to validate your findings. That is, how can you gather your information, and then you take time to write it up and to communicate it to others, to discuss it with others. So what are these steps? Firstly, organising. Secondly, reading through the data thoroughly. Thirdly, coding, analysis based on keywords, key ideas, common sense ideas, coding what's surprising and unanticipated, coding what's of particular interest. The code should be representative of categories, topics, settings, sorts of people. Decide how you're going to represent the codes, key words, key ideas, and then finally you gather it together and you write it all up. So coding's so important, these key ideas and themes and words. One could spend a long time discussing what is happening as you look for these key ideas and themes and words. And so in mathematics, you might talk about the different approaches that you've taken. You might talk about what you observe, and you look for these key ideas that make it work. In English, similar. And then to generate new knowledge as an educator and researcher, you want to gather the information together so that you've got new insights, valuable insights that help you to be better teachers and help our schools to be better schools. And we want these insights to be trustworthy, to be able to be validated. That is, we want clarity, we want being thorough, we want robust data collection and analysis of the data, and then triangulation. We want a series of supports. And you might want to trust your friends who are able to talk over whether your approach is sound. So these ideas are taken from the book that we have mentioned. And you can find out all of these details there from that resource that I have shared in the chat. And you might want to look at that and use some resources there. So let's go through and think about what stands out to us about the best approaches for analysing the data just from these ideas that we've briefly in the last 30 minutes gone through. Talia, what stood out to you from this brief overview of approaches to analysing the data, and how might it be applied in your situation? Talia?
Yeah, I think I thought it would be a bit easier to analyze my data. Can you go over the coding a little bit for me? Just go over what you mean by coding the data.
Yeah, well, just give us a couple of ideas that are coming from your data so far.
As in what I'm finding.
Yeah.
So, because I've got data from a phonological assessment that I've done a pre and a post. But so there's so many different categories that I'm covering in terms of like, yeah, there's like 5 or 6 different, I guess, things. But what I'm finding is what I suspected, and that explicit teaching of those things improved the students' phonological awareness, which the research then says would improve their literacy. But I'm just confused with how to write that up and make it into a graph or a code. I'm not sure about what the code means.
Well, I guess with the explicit teaching, can you think of 2 or 3 types of explicit teaching, Talia?
Well, what I've done is I've got the different, each week I chose a different part of phonological awareness, and we did whole class teaching for that. So say CVC segmenting, so consonant, vowel, consonant. We did a whole thing on segmenting, and then another week was blending. Then we've got like manipulation of phonemes and things like that. So I've got, I think, I can't remember how many actual things that I've targeted. And from what I can see looking at the pre and post, all the kids' scores were improved from the pre to the post. So
I guess the real question is, what is leading to what's triggering, and we've got neurological answers, we've got phonological answers, we've got heightened interest. There's a lot of things going on,
yeah,
and so I guess you really have to rank in order what you see as being most important. And so if you see the consonant, vowel, consonant approach, blending approach as being most important, then you might rank that sort of number 1. And if you see something else as less important, then you would rank it down. So I think ranking can,
okay,
in fact, be very useful at this stage, and thinking, and you could on different days rank things differently, but you got to think,
yeah,
for this project, what do you see as most important, most insightful? And then when you've got an idea, you might go to Google Scholar and the college library and do a quick search and think, hey, is this the key? Is this the
yeah,
gold? And I guess it's a bit like you rank things sort of gold, copper, and iron. What's the real gem that you think's standing out?
yeah. Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Isaac, what stood out to you in our little look at the analysis that we might do of the data?
Yeah. So let me get out of the busy room that I happen to be in. Likely, probably kind of, I was just reading through the article of that you put the link through, because kind of answering the same question to me of like the coding, and kind of just make sense of that. And I guess really just actually categorizing things, and like categorizing the research and like the results, and kind of like when it says code the data, and when I was just looking into, developed from categories. It's kind of, I guess that's something I'm trying to figure out, is how do I categorize and then prioritize what I think, all right, this is actually meaningful to what I'm trying to figure out, and maybe this other data I found isn't as relevant to what I'm actually researching. So it's probably a similar thing, but actually just being able to categorize the different findings and observations and then prioritize it from there.
Yeah, that's an important point. And what do you think are some of the more important categories, words, terms, themes that you would be finding, Isaac?
I guess for my specific research, I'm not 100% sure yet, because I've kind of just gathered it myself, and I haven't been able to go through. But I guess I'm looking for positive, like for my specific research, I'm looking for positive influence between like the different tests. I'm looking for an increase in engagement and attitude. So I guess when I'm looking at data, like as much as say I might find results are higher for certain things, that's actually not directly what I'm researching. That might be an indirect cause, but probably lower on my priority list of what I'm actually looking for, because it's actually more engagement and attitude that I'm looking for.
And you've got to make those decisions with, say, engagement, attitude, and other indirect links. And you can develop paragraphs for each one, you know, a paragraph on engagement, paragraph on attitudes, paragraph on indirect, and you can quote examples. And so you might quote student A said, and student George, not their real name. So you might put student George and then in brackets, not their real name, said, not for ethics purposes, you'd say not their real name, said. And then you would quote that as an example of engagement. So you're gathering the data in various ways. You're putting it different piles, putting it in different ways. And some people go through with a coloured highlighter and different colours. Others go through putting letter and number A3 and J4 for, you know, different categories. So you can try different ways of gathering the data in different ways. Yeah. SP, what are you finding?
I don't want to, sound like a broken record, but definitely I'm looking into the coding and the analyzing of the data, very similar to Isaac and Talia.
Yeah.
I think for me, just pulling up the article again, I think it was also just working out how to present it and how, because you've got to do the qualitative data as well as the quantitative data, looking at whether I separate that when presenting it, or do I do it a more holistic method of putting them together and making them, I'm going to say cohesifying, not sure if that's a word, but I'll say cohesifying the thing to make it the research project to make it one, make sense, but two, clearly express my findings.
Yeah, so certainly under data, you can lay out the data in various ways. If you find you've got too much data there, you can have an appendix. One person wrote 8,000 words on their paper and then had another 8,000 words in their appendix, which was all sorts of data that they'd gathered. So you can gather a lot of data, and often the data is fairly raw. You know, the data has not yet been categorized and sorted. That comes in the analysis stage. And so in the analysis stage, you begin to categorize it, you begin to sort it, you begin to put it in different piles, and you pull it apart in different ways. And that's where it eventually becomes the story that you're going to tell. And usually the story goes somewhere along the lines of what you're saying, but sometimes you'll find the story is the opposite to what you're saying. Sometimes interesting with the art example, you would think that giving some history and background could help the artwork and help the student. But there are others who say, no, it hinders because it actually puts them in a groove going a certain direction. So you're really looking at the pluses and minuses and sorting it out. And then you could try and back both outcomes. You could say, these are the advantages but disadvantages one way. These are the advantages, disadvantages of doing things the other way. So
Okay.
yeah, you're aiming for one big story that you're going to tell out of it. And it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You don't really know what the jigsaw puzzle's about until you put the last few pieces together, but that's where you're working towards. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nancy, how are you finding this analysis process?
Yeah, I'm a bit worried because I have a lot of data and I don't know how to organize this data and analyze it. Yeah, I'm a bit concerned. But
Yeah, and
step by
yeah,
step.
and certainly not alone with the challenge of a lot of data. Yeah, you then got to make some decision as to what's the structure that holds it all together. And so sometimes you find that there's a sequence in the data that is action A leads to B, which leads to C. Sometimes there's a sort of flow through of the data seems to flow from one to another. Sometimes there's a theory that seems to resonate with the data. That is, theory such and such seems to support the data, or it could be a series of theories. You know, theory A agrees, and then theory B disagrees. So in psychology in the 1880s, we had the emergence of behavioralism. That is, if you ring a bell, a dog will salivate, and if you reward students and give them a pat on the back, then they'll do well. So that's behavioralism, where you reward things. But then around about 1920s, a doctor in Vienna said, hang on, it's not simple. It's everything's happening in the subconscious. So you think it's happening there. And so the doctor's name was Freud. And then he came up with a whole new, different set of observations. And so his data collecting was different. And then someone else came along and said, no, Freud, you've missed out on something else. And so you have 10, 20 different psychological theories come from different ways the data is analysed on. So you gather the data and you put it together in the story that you feel is going to be most valuable to tell. Yeah. Jacob, how do you find analysing the data, coding the data? What's standing out to you?
Yeah, I think I'm having a similar kind of vibe with some of the other people who have responded, just in terms of feeling overwhelmed maybe isn't the correct word, but just feeling like there's a lot to kind of get my head around. So I think kind of the most important thing that I've taken a part of this is to really get a holistic kind of view of what your data is saying, so that you can provide that kind of one main story that seems to be coming out of the data that you've collected. So I think, yeah, being able to do that well is going to be the challenge. But I really like the idea of the critical friends that the chapter kind of touched on at the very end, in terms of just making sure that I guess the implications that you're taking from the data collected are credible and make sense. And I haven't heard of that before, but it seems like a very logical and sensible thing to do, to get someone else that you trust to have a look over it as well, and kind of say, oh, well, did you kind of come to the same conclusions as I did? Yep. Okay. Well, that makes sense. That kind of seems like the way to go.
Yeah, I think that's so true, isn't it? To have people look over it, because you can think you're seeing something that makes a lot of sense, but you may be misreading the data. Whereas the more people you have look at it, the more likely that they're going to guide you in the right direction. So they're great points. Jack, how do you find coding and analysing? Jack Stars.
Yeah, look, I think something I hadn't really considered is the idea of getting the data, analyzing the data, and then diving back into more assessment and more conversation. I think my kind of expectation has been of, well, no, the data will come in, then I'll just look at all of it. But I'm kind of interested in that once I've looked at the data, just reporting on it, of actually trying to find some key themes and going, you know what, I actually need to ask more about that, or ask more about that, or push more into that for that person. And I think, again, that'll show hopefully a bit more depth of insight. But then rather than my own, I guess, ideas of where it should go and ideas of what I'm expecting to get from the data, that won't be the main kind of thing that comes through, but rather that I'll see the data and go, okay, this is where the data wants to go. Okay, let's explore a bit more that way.
And it's a continual search for truth, isn't it? In over the years, you continually want to find out as an English teacher, how do we teach reading? How do we teach comprehension as a maths teacher? How do we teach engaging with the concepts and ideas in ways that come alive? And whatever subject we're working with, we think about how you can better understand the learning process and how can you better communicate. And as teachers, we try and do things on the whiteboard or the blackboard in the older days, and then you realize you need to encourage the students to have a go and to try things. So you continually trying to try different ways, to reflect on the different ways, and to learn. Emily, how are you finding this task of coding and analysing the data that you're collecting?
I was only just thinking about today, like, how am I going to compile all my data? So it was really good. Yeah, that like the coding and analyzing came up in that article. Yeah, like I was thinking, how am I going to present this? What are the different ways I can as well? Like, because I'm looking at the effectiveness of the spelling programs, but like what am I measuring that's it, like the effectiveness against? Like is it the student results, or is it kind of their engagement and spelling? Like, yeah.
That's an important question, isn't it? I mean, someone might get the spelling right, but they're not understanding some of the reasons for the different spellings. Sometimes we introduce some of the history of different words originating from different languages, or we introduce different rules. So there's lots of different approaches, aren't there, that they're very interesting. Jordan, how did you find this coding and analysing process?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. As a science teacher, I'm quite looking forward to the data analysis part of the project. What I found interesting though was the importance, and kind of comes back to what you were saying before, but then I saw it through a couple of the examples, was the importance of setting the context for the data. Like if you don't set the context and the setting for the data, then it kind of like, it doesn't really mean much to anyone, because you don't understand like the context in which it came from, and you don't understand how that might then be able to apply to yours. So that was something I hadn't really considered before. Actually, your comments before, and then actually seeing it, and I was just having a look through one of those projects as well. One question I did have though was, in terms of, obviously we'll have raw data, we'll have processed data, we'll need to think about how to present the data effectively. How much do we need to include all the raw data in appendixes, or is that not necessary? Just include relevant bits in the actual project?
Yeah, you don't have to include all of the raw data. You want to gather it and collect it somewhere, but you may not present it in your 8,000 words of your project. Often you may have tons and tons more data than you put in. And then often you may even keep that data for years afterwards, in that it's there in case you need to provide evidence for the ideas that you're presenting. The data is so important in that it has to be real data. In medicine, of course, it's very important that you've got accurate real data, but so too in teaching. It's important that we have accurate real data so that we can provide real evidence for what we're doing. And then evidence is so important. Evidence-based action is particularly important. What is the evidence that we have for the particular ways in which we teach? And you might have whole paragraphs where you say, from the evidence, from this research, it would appear that, and it's important to be able to describe that evidence. So they're great points. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any further questions on that?
No, that's that clears that up for me. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. And Rashani, what stood out to you from the coding and analysis of the data?
Yeah, so today's class, it has helped me to know what to do next after I collect my data. So I find the coding really, really important with the analysis part. So I will be trying to identify the key themes and patterns from the responses I have gathered, and I will try to categorize it, which will help me to narrow down the response. So I'll be using that.
Yeah. And so I encourage you to think further about coding and analysis of data in action research and in education as well. And so, yeah, certainly think about ways in which you can code and analyze the data in action research. So you can do a Google search on this, and you can also do a Google Scholar search on coding analysis of data in action research in education, schools, and teaching. And then if I do a Google search, I've got some discussion of the insights there. And then if I go to Google Scholar, then I've got scholarly articles down here and examples there. And then in that resource that we've shown you there today, there's examples as well. So yeah, lots of material that you can work with. Do we have any final questions that people have as we're drawing to a close for today? So it sounds like people are doing reasonably well. Certainly, they're very interesting, the findings that you're discovering, and particularly as they relate to the sort of areas that you are looking at. I think that's really very interesting. And so I encourage you to explore that further. This is another example taken from that book, Close Reading, in the urban classroom. The purpose of this action research project is to discuss the experience within teaching of close reading using orthoethnographic methods. And then you've got your introduction, then you've got your method, where you're going to examine what's taking place. The literature review discusses what's happening, and then you gather the material. So methodology gathers the material, and then coding. So you look for themes, you look for ideas, and then you present your findings there as well. Yeah, I think it'll be a lot of fun. I think you'll get some great insights from the project. Certainly, if you have any questions at all, send them through to me. Happy to answer those and work with you on helping you through those. We meet again in 2 weeks' time. And so I encourage you then, if you have further questions, you can bring those along in 2 weeks' time as well. And yeah, I look forward to reading and finding out more about the areas that you're working in. They're so interesting, and I think your findings are very valuable. And this whole action research approach, I think, is very valuable as part of the ways in which we learn about the effectiveness of the different methods that we use. So thank you each one, and I look forward to keeping in touch. So thank you. and just yell out if you have any further questions.
Thank you.
Later.
Sam.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks for all that you're doing. It's appreciated and valuable. Thank you.